If, as Sun Tzu wrote centuries ago, all war is based on deception, then the Second World War was the greatest canvas upon which the art of the lie was ever painted. And the artist holding the brush was not a trained killer, nor a seasoned diplomat, nor a military strategist. He was a balding, bespectacled poultry farmer from Barcelona named Juan Pujol García. This is the story of how a man with nothing but a fertile imagination and sheer, unadulterated nerve, bolstered by a wife of equal cunning, managed to fool the most terrifying intelligence apparatus in history. To understand the lie, one must understand the liar. Born in 1912 into a liberal, progressive family in Catalonia, Juan Pujol grew up in an environment that prized tolerance and despised fanaticism. He was an unremarkable young man, destined for a quiet life managing a hotel or raising chickens. But history had other plans. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War tore the Iberian Peninsula apart, serving as a brutal dress rehearsal for the global conflict to come. For Juan, the Civil War was a nightmare of extremism. He found himself trapped between two ideologies he loathed. He was initially conscripted by the Republican side, an eclectic mix of Democrats, socialists, and communists, but he was horrified by the chaotic violence and the red terror inflicted by the hardliners. Desperate to escape, he deserted, hiding in his girlfriend's apartment, losing 30 pounds in captivity and fear. Eventually, he crossed the lines to join General Francisco Franco's nationalists, only to find the fascism on the right just as repugnant as the extremism on the left. By the time Franco declared victory in 1939, establishing a dictatorship, Juan Pujol had served both sides and remained loyal to neither. He had learned a singular, powerful lesson. He possessed a talent for survival, and he could lie with the conviction of a saint. As the dust settled in Spain, the darkness spread across Europe. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The world was sliding into the abyss. Juan, now married to the stunningly beautiful Araceli González Carballo, watched from neutral Spain with a growing sense of dread. He believed fanatically that Hitler was the enemy of civilization itself. He saw Britain as the lone candle flickering against a hurricane of fascism. Most men in his position would have been content to stay neutral, to keep their heads down in Franco's Spain. But Juan Pujol was not most men. He decided, with a naivety that bordered on madness, that it was his personal duty to save humanity. In January 1941, he took his first step. He was a nobody, a hotel manager with no military training, no contacts, and no experience. The British intelligence officers, understandably, laughed him out of the room. They had no use for an amateur Spanish adventurer. Rejection, however, did not sit well with the Pujols. It was here that Araceli, a woman of fierce intelligence and Galician grit, stepped out of the shadows. If the British wouldn't let Juan in the front door, she reasoned, perhaps they would let him in the back. If they could not work for the British directly, they would work for the Germans first, become valuable, and then turn double agent. It was a plan of breathtaking danger. Juan Pujol needed to become a Nazi, or rather, he needed to become the idea of a Nazi. He crafted a persona, a fanatical, pro-fascist Spanish government official who believed that England must be destroyed for the New World Order. He ranted, he raved, and he eventually caught the eye of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. Gustav Liesner. Here was a man with a diplomatic passport, which Juan had forged in a print shop, and a burning desire to travel to London to spy for the Reich. The Germans, desperate for eyes and ears inside the fortress island of Britain, swallowed the bait. They christened him Agent Alaric. They gave him a crash course in espionage that was almost comical in its brevity. He was taught how to use secret invisible ink, given a codebook to encrypt messages, and handed $3,000, a small fortune, to fund his operations. His instructions were simple: go to London, recruit a network of spies, and report back on British morale and troop movements. There was just one problem. Juan Pujol had no way to get to London. His visa was a fake. He couldn't actually leave the Iberian Peninsula. Undeterred, Juan and Araceli moved to Lisbon, Portugal. To the Abwehr, he reported that he had successfully arrived in England. In reality, he was sitting in a rented apartment in Lisbon, staring at a map of Great Britain, a Baedeker tourist guide he had checked out from the local library, and a train timetable. Thus began the Lisbon period, a masterclass in fiction writing. From his desk in Portugal, Juan began to invent a country he had never visited. He wrote reports about the gloom of the English weather, the morale of the people, and the movements of the fleet. He calculated train travel times using his out-of-date guidebooks. He invented a contact, a pilot for KLM Airlines, who would supposedly courier his letters from London to Lisbon to avoid the British censors, explaining why the postmarks were Portuguese. He made mistakes, of course. In one report, he mentioned a contact in Glasgow who would do anything for a litre of wine, unaware that the Scots preferred whiskey. He wrote about men sweltering in the heat of a British summer, a climatic impossibility that somehow slipped past the Germans. But his confidence was so absolute, his prose so flowery and filled with Nazi zeal, that the Germans believed every word. They didn't just believe him, they adored him. While Juan spun his web, Araceli played the role of the suffering wife to perfection. When the Abwehr in Madrid hadn't heard from Alaric for a while and grew suspicious, Araceli marched into the German embassy. She wept. She screamed. She told Federico Knappe, Juan's handler, that her husband had vanished into the fogs of London, abandoning her and their child for the cause of the Reich. She threatened to go to the police if they didn't help her. Terrified that this hysterical woman would blow their top agent's cover, the Germans comforted her, reassured her of Juan's heroism, and inadvertently confirmed to her that they still bought the lie completely. By 1942, the situation had become surreal. Juan Pujol was running a network of imaginary sub-agents in Britain from a desk in Portugal, and the British still didn't know he existed. Or rather, they knew someone existed. MI6, having cracked the German Enigma codes, was intercepting reports from a German spy named Alaric, who seemed to be operating freely in England. The British were baffled. They couldn't find this man. His reports were a strange mix of accurate news lifted from British newspapers Juan bought in Lisbon, and bizarre hallucinations. Finally, the Americans intervened. Araceli approached the US naval attaché in Lisbon, Edward Rousseau, and laid her cards on the table. She proved that her husband was the head of a German spy ring and that he wanted to defect. The Americans, recognizing a potential gold mine, pressured the British to take a second look. When MI5 finally realized that the dangerous German spy Alaric and the crazy Spaniard they had rejected a year prior were the same person, the realization was electric. They smuggled Juan and Araceli out of Portugal and into Britain. On April 24, 1942, Juan Pujol García finally set foot on the soil of the country he had been pretending to inhabit for a year. He was brought to London and introduced to his MI5 handler, Thomas "Tommy" Harris. It was a match made in espionage heaven. Harris was an art dealer in his civilian life, a man of culture and imagination who spoke fluent Spanish. He saw immediately that Juan was not just a spy, he was a creative genius. Harris realized that MI5 shouldn't just run Juan, they should unleash him. They gave him a new code name, one that reflected his ability to act out any role, Garbo, after the great actress Greta Garbo. Together, Harris and Garbo set up shop in a nondescript office on Jermyn Street. They turned Juan's freelance fiction into an industrial-scale deception operation. They expanded his imaginary network. There was Agent 1, a disaffected waiter in Gibraltar. There was Agent 3, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow with a penchant for partying. There was the Welsh nationalist in Swansea, a fascist fanatic who led a group called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order. There was a moonlighting clerk in the Ministry of Information. None of them existed. Every letter, every report, every expense claim for their travel and lodging was typed up by Juan and Tommy Harris. They created distinct handwriting styles for each agent. They invented illnesses for them. When they needed to stop reporting from a certain area, they would have an agent get arrested or die. They even published a fake obituary in a Liverpool newspaper for one of their imaginary spies, which they then clipped and sent to the Germans as proof of their tragic loss. The Abwehr, touched by the loyalty of these non-existent men, agreed to pay pensions to their imaginary widows. The volume of traffic was staggering. They sent hundreds of letters and thousands of radio messages. The goal was to clog the German intelligence machine with noise, a mix of truth, half-truth, and pure fabrication. But while the professional marriage between Harris and Pujol was thriving, the real marriage between Juan and Araceli was crumbling. London in the Blitz was a grey, terrifying, and lonely place for a young Spanish woman who spoke no English. While Juan was off playing the great game, Araceli was trapped in a house in the suburbs with 2 small children, forbidden from interacting with other Spaniards for fear of blowing her husband's cover. The tension boiled over in 1943. Overcome with homesickness and furious at her isolation, Araceli snapped. She demanded to go back to Spain. When Tommy Harris tried to placate her, she threatened to march to the Spanish embassy and reveal the entire operation. It was a catastrophe in the making. The entire double-cross system, the security of the Allied war effort, hung on the silence of this one unhappy woman. Harris and Pujol had to resort to their most elaborate deception yet, a play performed for an audience of one. Harris arrived at the Pujol home and gravely informed Araceli that because of her outburst, Juan had been arrested. He was no longer trusted. Araceli was then taken to Camp 020, MI5's interrogation center. Juan had been allowed to grow a beard. He looked unshaven, weeping, dressed in prison fatigues, and broken. He played the part of the condemned man perfectly. Terrified that her anger had destroyed her husband, Araceli broke down. She promised to sign anything, to do anything, if only they would release him. The British relented, Juan was released, and the crisis was averted. It was a cruel trick, perhaps, but it saved the mission. By January 1944, the tide of the war was turning. The Allies were preparing for the final, decisive blow. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. The Germans knew it was coming. The Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications, was waiting. If the Germans could pinpoint where the Allies would land, they could concentrate their panzer divisions and push the invasion force back into the sea. If the invasion failed, the war could drag on for years, or even be lost. The Allies needed a miracle. They needed to convince Hitler that the attack was coming not at Normandy. This deception was codenamed Operation Fortitude, and Agent Garbo was its linchpin. Harris and Pujol went to work. They created an entire phantom military force, the first United States Army group, FUSAG. This army supposedly consisted of 150,000 men, 11 divisions, tanks, and artillery, all stationed in the southeast of England, directly across from Calais. To sell the lie, the Allies built inflatable tanks and plywood planes and placed them in fields where German reconnaissance planes could photograph them. But the physical deception needed a voice. Garbo provided it. His network of imaginary agents began to report a frenzy of activity in the southeast. His agents saw patches on soldiers' uniforms identifying them as belonging to FUSAG. They reported trains packed with equipment heading to Dover and Folkestone. They reported the arrival of General George S. Patton. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. They considered him their equal in tank warfare. It made perfect sense to the German High Command that Patton would lead the main invasion force. Placing him in charge of the fictitious FUSAG was a masterstroke. The Germans became convinced that the build-up in the southeast was real. As D-Day approached, the tension in the office on Jermyn Street was suffocating. Juan sat at his radio transmitter, tapping out messages that would decide the fate of thousands of men. The Germans trusted him implicitly. They had even stopped trying to infiltrate other spies into Britain because they believed Garbo had the entire country covered. On June 5, 1944, the invasion fleet was in the water. The weather was atrocious. Eisenhower gave the order, go. In the early hours of June 6th, as paratroopers were dropping into the dark fields of Normandy, and soldiers were vomiting in the landing craft churning toward Omaha and Utah beaches, Garbo played his highest card. At 3 a.m., Garbo radioed Madrid. He had urgent intelligence, but in a twist of fate that no scriptwriter could invent, the German radio operator in Madrid had gone off duty. Garbo tapped and tapped, but there was no answer. It wasn't until hours later, after the first waves of troops were already dying on the sand, that the German operator came back on air. Garbo, furious, reprimanded the Germans for their laziness. "I am disgusted," he typed. "I cannot accept excuses and negligence." The Germans, cowed by their star agent's anger, apologized profusely. Then Garbo delivered the message. He reported the landings in Normandy, but he framed them with a deadly lie. He told the Germans that the assault on Normandy was a diversionary maneuver. Its purpose, he explained, was to draw German reserves away from the Pas-de-Calais so that the real invasion force, Patton's FUSAG, could strike across the Strait of Dover. It was the big lie, and in Berlin, the High Command was paralyzed. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was away celebrating his wife's birthday. Hitler was asleep, and his aides were terrified to wake him. When the Führer finally awoke, he read Garbo's assessment. It confirmed what he wanted to believe. The attack on Normandy was a trap. The real blow was yet to come. Crucially, Rommel and Rundstedt had powerful panzer divisions held in reserve. If they moved them to Normandy immediately, they could crush the fragile Allied beachhead. But on the strength of Garbo's intelligence, supported by the broader Fortitude deception, Hitler ordered the tanks to stay put. He kept the 15th Army, nearly 20 heavily armed divisions, waiting in the Pas-de-Calais for an invasion that would never come. For days, and then weeks, Garbo kept up the ruse. He reported that the ships off Normandy were just a fraction of the Allied naval power. The Germans waited. And while they waited, the Allies poured men and material into France, securing the beachhead, breaking out into the hedgerows, and beginning the liberation of Europe. By the time the Germans realized they had been duped, it was too late. The war in the West was lost. The irony of Juan Pujol's success was absolute. He had done more to damage the German war effort than entire divisions of soldiers, yet the Germans considered him their greatest hero. On July 29, 1944, a message arrived from Berlin. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, had personally authorized the awarding of the Iron Cross, second class, to Agent Alaric for his extraordinary services to the Reich. Juan, sitting in London with Tommy Harris, had to suppress a laugh as he radioed back his humble thanks, expressing his unworthy gratitude to the Führer. 5 months later, in a secret ceremony, King George VI awarded Juan Pujol the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE. He became the only man in the Second World War to receive high decorations from both opposing sides. But as the war ground to a bloody halt in 1945, the thrill of the game was replaced by a cold fear. Juan Pujol knew too much. He knew the names, the codes, the secrets. He had humiliated the Nazi regime. Although Hitler was dead, the intricate web of Nazi sympathizers remained. Juan was terrified of reprisals. He feared that a Fourth Reich or a rogue assassin would track him down and kill him and his family. He had one final trick to play. He had to disappear. After the war, with the help of MI5, Juan and Araceli traveled to Madrid. Araceli went to the German embassy one last time to collect a final payment for Alaric's services, 25,000 pesetas. Even in defeat, the German network remained loyal to their phantom spy. From Spain, the family fled to Venezuela. Araceli, the woman whose quick thinking had started the whole adventure, could no longer live in the shadow of her husband's paranoia. They separated. Araceli returned to Spain with the children, where she eventually remarried and built a new life, working as a translator and running an art gallery, and, rumor has it, occasionally helping the CIA, unable to completely leave the world of shadows behind. Juan remained in South America. In 1949, the British ambassador to Spain informed the world of a tragedy. Juan Pujol García had died of malaria while on a trip to Angola. His obituary was published. The world mourned the passing of a minor historical figure, and Agent Garbo ceased to exist. Juan Pujol was dead, but the man who used to be him was living a quiet, anonymous life in Lagunillas, Venezuela. He ran a bookstore. He taught Spanish, giving private lessons for Shell Oil employees. He remarried and had another family. For 3 decades, he lived as a ghost. His new wife and children knew nothing of the man who had fooled Hitler. They knew him only as a quiet, slightly boring old man who liked to read. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the silence was broken. A British author specializing in espionage, Nigel West, the pen name of Rupert Allison, began digging into the archives. He became obsessed with the story of Garbo. The official records said he was dead, but West wasn't convinced. The details of the malaria death in Angola felt staged. It felt like something Garbo would have written. West managed to track down some of Garbo's pre-war associates and eventually made contact with a nephew. Following a trail of breadcrumbs that led to Venezuela, West finally found a phone number. He called it. The voice on the other end was old, but the mind was sharp. Juan Pujol was alive. In 1984, the ghost returned to London. It was an emotional homecoming. Juan was reunited with the few surviving members of his MI5 team. He was taken to Buckingham Palace, where Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, formally presented him with the MBE medal that he had been awarded in secret 40 years earlier. The press went wild. The spy who saved D-Day became a sensation, but perhaps the most poignant moment came when Juan visited the beaches of Normandy. It was the 40th anniversary of the invasion. He walked among the rows of white crosses in the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. He saw the dates on the headstones. June 6th, June 7th, June 8th, 1944. Tears streamed down the old man's face. For decades, he had lived with the abstraction of his work, letters, codes, radio waves. Now, he saw the reality. He saw the men who had died, and he thought of the thousands more who would have died if the Panzers had been unleashed on that first day. He turned to the people around him, his voice trembling, and said, "I don't think I did enough." It was the only time in his life that Juan Pujol García was wrong. He died in Caracas in 1988, followed by Araceli in 1990. They left behind a legacy that defies belief. In a world of bloodshed and brutality, they had fought a war with nothing but words. They proved that while violence can destroy bodies, it is imagination that conquers minds. And in the end, the chicken farmer from Barcelona had spun a tale so compelling that it saved the world.